Video 9.1 Weekly Context.
Hello everyone and welcome to week 9. I want to apologize in advance. We don't have any inspiration for this week, but nonetheless we will survive. Our focus for this week is the second iteration of the design cycle. So we're going to do a quick review. At this point, you should have gone through the process of planning out your design project. Moving from that, you would have curated some resources to help you in your work. Then you would have created assets that you were going to use in your design project. And in the next phase, you would put all of these pieces together in the composition stage. And essentially, you would have a final product that is ready to share with your peers. This was thus, the phase for last week, where you did a sharing and critique. Now, the second iteration of this process is a little less structured than the first. For example, you're not necessarily going to start with the planning phase, although you may go back to the planning phase. Where you proceed from here is going to depend largely on the feedback that you received last week on your work and what you are identifying as the key things that need to be done as you move forward. For the purpose of this week's video, we're going to explore a few things that can help you in this second iteration of the design cycle. The first thing is, how can the principles of user-centered design improve the design process and design artifact? You'll recall we spoke briefly last week about emotion and the role that it plays in the user experience, and so user-centered design really focuses on these things. The second question that we're going to take a look at is, what are the next steps that need to be taken in order to respond to the critique that you have received and as you revise your design artifact. And then finally, we're going to look at how your understanding of an application actually impacts your ability to solve design problems. Now, this is a somewhat philosophically complex discussion, and we're going to look at a couple of examples that can help demonstrate how what you know and how you know really influence what you're going to do. So the first question we're going to explore today is how the principles of user-centered design can improve the design process and the design artifact. Now, user-centered design is an approach to design that is very specific in that it follows a basic principle. And this principle is that the best designed artifacts result from an understanding of the people who use them. Again, the focus here is on the user, and this should be your focus in all of your visual design work. Essentially, you should be constantly thinking about the person who is going to be looking at whatever it is that you've created and how they're going to experience that. So once you've received some feedback on your design work from people who have experienced it, you're going to have a sense of, what your design is communicating, and you're going to need to revise where necessary. Some things that you should be asking yourself as you look at the revisions that you need to make are, how does your design align with your design goals? So, was your design goal to instruct and direct? Or was it to inform and guide? For example, did you do an infographic that was trying to give people instructions on something? Or were you trying to get people involved in something that was beyond the scope of the artifact? For example, when we looked at the billboard example and we talked about integrating a Twitter feed into a billboard to add a level of interactivity. These are all design goals that you would have established early on in the planning stage. So now that you've received some feedback, what you need to do is go back to those design goals to see whether or not you are fulfilling them. Once you have re-established the primary function of your artifact, you can now use this as the focus of your revision for the second iteration. So, the next question is, what are the next steps that need to be taken in order to respond to the critique and revise the design? This can be a difficult question to answer depending on the type of feedback that you got. However, one of the things to consider is, once you have received feedback, was it good feedback or bad feedback? Remembering what we talked about last time in terms of critique, and how will this feedback inform where you want to go next? Remember that not all feedback may be consistent. So what you need to start to do is realign whether or not the feedback actually relates to the design goals, and ask yourself whether or not your design goals have been met. The objective here is to see whether or not what you are doing is actually what you intended to do from the perspective of those who have actually viewed your work. You will find that in some cases the feedback will be obvious, while in others it will require some discussion or reflection. When thinking about the points of feedback that are less obvious, there's a few things that you can consider. The first thing is, did the feedback come from more than one source? As we've noted, people have different opinions on your work. However, if you get a reoccurring opinion or reoccurring perspective, this is something that you want to take into consideration. This can only happen if you've received feedback from more than one person. The second thing to think about is, how does the feedback relate to your design goals? For example, if one of your design goals was to create an artifact that was accessible to people, and you received feedback that it was difficult to open or hard to navigate, then this should be a priority for you in your next stage of revisions. Thirdly, you need to think about whether or not your revisions are feasible based on the feedback that's provided. Sometimes we receive feedback that's good, but not necessarily attainable given the constraints of the project. These things usually start with people saying, "It would be really cool if," and the "if" is something that requires a complete revision of all of your work. So even though you might really want to do that "if," you really need to ask yourself whether or not the revision would be worth it. So now that you've received some feedback from other people, you'll have an idea of the kinds of revisions that you want to make. This leads us to the next question of, how does your understanding of an application impact your ability to solve design problems? The reason this is important, because for every what that has been identified in your feedback, you need to think about the how. Essentially, what this means is, if somebody says it would be really cool if you had motion graphics, you need to be able to understand, okay, how do I do that? So when you're looking at making revisions, the question that should come to your mind first is, do you know how to do what you're hoping to do? This is an important question because adding elements like motion graphics and masking and depth of field is very cool and could add to the functionality of your design. However, if you're not sure how to do these things technically, then you're going to need to learn. Essentially, your comfort and familiarity with an application influences not only how you do something, but what you understand to be possible. And this is the philosophical component that I was referring to earlier. I've experienced this countless times where I've been working on an application for months, and then I connect with somebody who knows more about that application than I do, and I have the "I didn't know that you could do that" moment. So this alters my understanding of what I can use that application for. So let's take a look at a specific example. Keynote is a great application for making presentations, and it has a complex system of animations. However, if you've never used the animations, you wouldn't necessarily know that they were there or what they can do for you. But once you are able to use the animations and recognize them, you can look at different ways to structure information, just as that animation that I did there, which was a little bit rushed. I should have edited that. Sorry. So when we look at this, what essentially has occurred is that the capacities of the application actually change the approach we take to the design problem. The information that I just provided, let's look at the animation again, could have just been provided in a text format. But instead, if I use the animation capacities of a Keynote, so for example right here we have the Keynote icon, this could have been a text if I didn't know I could use images in Keynote, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale the icon up, going to change the opacity, and then I'm going to drop it out of the screen and bring in the next form of text. So the idea here, it's only if I understand what the application can do, can I start to think about different ways to present information. Now, it's important to understand that all applications have a learning curve. Some learning curves are steeper than others. So let's take another quick example. If you wanted to learn how to edit video, you might begin with QuickTime Pro. This is a program that provides some basic functionality, and there is a little bit of a learning curve that you need to experience. Eventually what's going to happen, though, is you're going to get to the top of the learning curve for that application. You know how to use QuickTime Pro, no problem. Once you've hit this point, you're going to be thinking differently about how the application can be used in relation to your design problems. So this might bring you to another program such as iMovie, for example. We'll stay in the Apple ecosystem. And then what ends up happening here is you start to teach yourself iMovie. Now, as your thinking becomes more complex, the tool set also becomes more complex because it needs to be more complex to do what you want it to do. Essentially, your learning curve never stops. You keep going. So we can extend this even further. So let's just say you want to look at another program. Maybe iMovie can't do something cool like edit titles, which it can't. So what you can do is you can learn Final Cut Pro in conjunction with another program like Motion 5, and this allows you to do more complex things. The progression here is not that these three applications are amazing, which they are very useful, but the point is that the progression is in your understanding of the applications. And once your understanding of one application becomes maximized, it leads you to the development or adoption of another application. So, in essence, the what you know about a technology also influences how you know about the technology. So your understanding of how to do things is influenced by what you can do. So the only question that really remains is, where do you start? So at this stage, you've been working very hard and you should have some artifacts that you're ready to present and share with your peers. We're going to get to the showcasing stage of the course in a few weeks, but I want to provide you with a couple more questions to think about as you're revising and collecting more feedback and working towards your finished version of your design work. The first question relates to the feedback that you have already received, and this is, what is the experience or reaction that people have to your design artifacts? Following from this is the consideration of what the reaction was that you wanted to have. You should consider why or why not. What was your goal? Did you want people to enjoy your artifact? Did you want them to think when they were experiencing your artifact? Did you want them to be confused by your artifact? Regardless of what your goal was, you need to think about whether or not you achieved it in the reaction that the person was having. And again, if you're thinking about something that relates to your design goals, this influences how you're going to revise in the next steps. The next question to think about is, in what way does your critique relate to those goals that you had for your design? An example of this is what we've previously mentioned, was if you wanted your artifact to be accessible, but you received feedback that it was not, then this is something that directly relates to your goal of accessibility and consequently is something you're going to want to address in your next steps. This leads to the next question of what new problems have emerged from the critique that are going to require a response. These problems may be in relation to the critique that has been provided, or may also be related to your revisions of your design goals. The beauty, or for some the calamity, is that there are always going to be new challenges that you're going to overcome. The challenge with the challenges is figuring out which ones are a priority. The final question is to give you consideration of the ways in which you're using multiple mediums to enhance the effectiveness of your design artifacts. As noted earlier in the course, the use of multiple mediums helps to establish a connection to the multiple senses of the viewer. When done appropriately, this can be a powerful tool in the communication of information. The challenge here is to assess your use of media as well as the design principles and to identify if there are elements that can be added to improve the overall impact of your artifact.